Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. It's HCDC's Huddle. Our every third Wednesday, our installments for bringing you the support and resources you need to build better businesses. Today, we've got Stephen Taylor from Untold Content. Stephen can provide a better in-depth background of himself, but just a high-level background. He's got a PhD in Untold Content, as a collection of PhDs that really specializes in helping innovators tell more effective stories to their clients, to all sorts of different organizations and stakeholders. They've worked with some pretty cool companies, both in the small and the big size. So companies like Procter here locally in Cincinnati, but then obviously what we were talking about before, Flywheels and a sustainability accelerator here in Cincinnati, a social impact accelerator, and they worked with them as well. So I'll turn it over to Stephen. We'd love to hear the insights that you're going to bring to all of us on how to tell better, more effective innovation stories.
Excellent. Paul, thank you so much for inviting us. And I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit of insights around innovation storytelling. And before I start, I'll say this is probably going to be a slightly different storytelling talk or presentation than what you've seen. So I hope you find this interesting and informing, and hopefully you take away a couple of things that you can use immediately. But to kick off, let's just do a brief introduction to Untold Content. We always say that the future is untold. Let's write it together. But what we call ourselves innovation storytellers. And so we help innovative organizations, and that could be large organizations, it could be nonprofits, it could be social innovation groups, it could be startups. Those that are trying to do something that is unique, that is trying to create a new space and push against the envelope. We help them find that strategic narrative and get content out that really drives their mission and really touches the audience that they're looking to get in front of. And so our content really goes in a lot of different directions. A lot of times we say that we're content agnostic. The goal is to get the job done. And so we use content as that vehicle. And so to bring that to life, our goal is to bring ideas to life. And that looks like content strategy and creation services. It could be instructional design if organizations are trying to inform people within their organization or possibly outside, and also training experiences. And so what we're going to talk about today, and we worked with a lot of different organizations from the early stage startup all the way through large governmental or large organizations. So we kind of span the gamut and we bring that expertise to anything that we work on. Okay, so that's Untold Content. And as we get started, the thing that I want you to think about is, what is the story that you've heard around an innovation that's actually moved you to want to do something different? And the reason why I ask you to think about that is that this story that I'm about to let you listen to is that story for me. And I heard this initially when I was in graduate school, and it really fueled me wanting to go into industry. But then when I had the chance to move away from chemistry and move more into the consulting world and work on things like innovation storytelling, it was something that really drove me forward. So this is the birth of Crest White Strips.
And so a couple of the innovators in our program had been looking for how we can take the chemistry that you need to have to create whitening, true whitening in the oral cavity, and keep it there long enough so that it actually work, right? So in science, we talk about rates and kinetics of reactions. And the problem with the mouth is that your saliva keeps clearing everything that you put into your mouth. And the technical problem was, how do you keep the material present in a way that would be both safe and effective? And so we had done some real great work on the actual basic chemistry, but keeping it there long enough was the challenge. And at the same time, in another part of our R&D organization, we were developing wrap materials for food preservation, and actually licensed some of that technology to GLAD, so people understand that the GLAD press and seal food wrap is actually a P&G discovery.
Interesting.
And so the team that was working on that technology, material science, wrap materials, right, happened to be in the cafeteria talking to one of the guys that was doing the chemistry work. And it's really a fascinating material because it has little dimples in it, the food wrap.
Yes.
And as you depress those dimples, they change the surface tension and they cling to whatever object it is. You know, it's the great demo is you can turn your salad bowl upside down
Yes,
and the salad stays in and shake it, right? And so the Paul Segel, who was the innovator in our organization, kind of looked at that and said, hey, have you ever put anything into those little dimples? And the material science guys said, why in the heck would you want to do that? They wouldn't work if you put anything in there. And he said, well, do you think they could contain chemistry? And they said, yeah, we never tried that. So Paul literally rushed back to his lab and he had created a gel with the whitening chemistry in the gel. And he spread the gel across the food wrap material and then cut it into little strips. And he wrapped it around his teeth. And it wrapped beautifully, right? It stayed in place.
Yeah.
Even when the tongue bumped up against it. And he literally, a few hours later, comes running into my lab in my office.
What was your role at the time?
I was the director for product development for the oral care business for Procter & Gamble. And Paul said, I figured it out. Look, and he grabs me by the shoulders and he pulls his face right up to my face. We're standing nose to nose and he goes, look, it's working. And I'm looking at him going, what are you talking about? I don't see anything. And he goes, that's the beauty of it. You can't even tell it's working and it's there. And that's how White Strips was born.
Because of a moment in the cafeteria, and outside the box thinking.
And exactly. Two technologists who had a predisposition to think out of the box and be creative in the moment. And so we disrupted the field. We were the first to create, a consumer safe and effective whitening technology. And how many proms and weddings there have been since, but it's hundreds of millions of dollars worth of business for the company.
Yes.
So new business development, new product discovery, great consumer need being met in that way.
Awesome. So that's one of my favorite stories around an innovation. And can you see it occurring? Can you actually see that instance going on in the cafeteria? And people are just staying late at work and they're, talking about what they're doing during the day. Can you probably even smell what the food was that was in the cafeteria? Or could you imagine someone running to you because they're so excited because they figured something out that just unlocked something for them or unlocked a new path for a product, and then coming up and like grabbing you and shake you, hug you? I know this is COVID world, so not as much hugging right now, but so excited in what they're doing. This to me is the power of innovation storytelling, is that it really brings the stories, the personal experiences together with the strategic narratives in order to drive innovation objectives. And so this is really what we're trying to bring to both startups and to large brands, is how do we tell stories like this so that they are both memorable, so that they are engaging, and that you're driving something. And you can think about from this story, what sharing this story would do to a culture, at an organization as big as Procter & Gamble. It can just say, hey, this is the expectation. This is the behavior that we would love to see happening more often. And you actually don't have to sit there and, say it with those words. You can. Okay, so we're going to talk about unlocking storylines, and specifically, how do we unlock those types of storylines for innovation success? and give you a little overview of what you're going to get today. We're going to talk a little bit about a background. We're going to introduce innovation storytelling. We're going to talk about why innovate be powerful storytellers. And then we'll go into a little bit of those basic structures of story. We'll talk about some tools at a workshop that we're going to be hosting. What I hope that you take away is, one, increased awareness around what this is and potentially how to do it better and how to leverage these stories to drive your organization's mission. Also, take away some tools that you can immediately implement in your work, and also find some resources that you can use right now and then potentially build into those skills as you go. Our team at Untold, as Paul mentioned, we kind of have a unique collective of experts from, so my PhD, I'm a PhD chemist. Alicia, our creative director, has a PhD in nuclear forensics. And then we have a lot of Katie and Kendall and Meredith all have backgrounds in rhetoric and composition and instructional design and technical writing. So we really bring these two sets of skills together in order to help organizations find that strategic narrative and how to tell that story so that they motivate that audience. But as I said, I'm a chemist and I spent about a decade in industry. So I approached this with a very experiential, like what was my experience and what were the things that motivated me whenever I was talking with customers and the stories that I would hear, and what were things, we worked with airbags, I've worked with muscles, I've worked with chemicals that change colors, all sorts of different processes. Like the stories behind each of those are really meaningful in how they impacted me. But at the same time, while I was going through that experience, I was also reading a lot about stories and how people use stories in order to change cultures. And it really started for me with The Hero with 1,000 Faces. So if people know about the hero's journey, they should know that The Hero with 1,000 Faces is really the origin of the hero's journey. And it talks about how a hero, usually from the hero's perspective, a lot of these stories are based on tribals, based on tribal groups. And when someone actually left and tried to do something new, go beyond their community, it was really important because that expanded the community of that group and it gave them ways in which they can grow that they didn't have before. And that is essentially the basis of the hero's journey. But I got really fascinated with lots of different types of books on storytelling. And so you have some things that are like the really popular Story Brand by Donald Miller, or you can get into things like Narrative is Everything from Randy Olson, talking about ABT frameworks. Narrative Economics by Robert Schiller talks about how narrative actually drives economic behavior. So there's just so much that's out there that it's really hard to kind of like to get through it all, one, and then also find what are these real story patterns that really drive change from an innovations perspective and really drive culture and behavioral change. So we also went through and looked at literature. And so this is the peer review literature. Once again, trying to see what the correlation was with storytelling and the innovation process. And so once again, what we found is that the resources were really scattered. You would find some in like organizational science that talked about the role of narratives in sustaining innovation, but it was never like, here's the set of tools that you need in order to create a great innovation story. And so what we really came out with is that there isn't one set of tools, and that people really need to know, have a breadth of exposure to different tools in different contexts so that they know when do they need to know use which story. So what we did after doing all this literature review and reading all this information on storytelling and innovation, we decided to start a podcast. So this is a local Cincinnati podcast. We record it down down in downtown Cincinnati. But what we did is that we went out and talked to innovators, so over 100 innovators from around the world, and talked about how did they use stories in their everyday life. And so there's a lot of people that are local, like Kathy Fish, who is the Chief Research Officer of Procter & Gamble. But we also talked with NASA. We've talked with people from Disney, just really just going out and seeing in different fields what are the similarities, what are the commonalities that people, processes that people use in order to tell stories in their innovative work. And so why is it something that we wanted to spend so much time on? And the real reason why comes back to time. How much time people spend actually crafting, creating, sharing, hearing stories, artifacts, papers, or presentations. And what we found is that on average, innovators spend about 12 hours a week, in some form of storytelling, either sharing the story, creating the story, or in listening to other people's stories. And that's all dependent on the size of the organization. Large organizations is more on that 12. And then smaller organizations can be, might be a little bit higher. And so the goal around innovation storytelling is how do we make that process more efficient? Because you're spending 30% of your time doing this, whether you're probably thinking about it or not. So how can we make that about 30% more efficient? So basically give you back about 10% of your work week. Or how can we make those stories more effective because they're really targeted to drive the goal and the mission that you to get to the next step in your process. So this was a lot around the driver of why this is important. And so through all of this, what we came out with is a definition around innovation storytelling and what it is. And then we'll get into a little bit of how to do it well. So at a basic level, innovation storytelling is the art and science of communicating strategic narratives and personal experiences about new product developments, systems improvements, groundbreaking new thinking to drive these innovation objectives. And so once again, from a startup standpoint, getting people to accept your idea. From a large organization standpoint, it could be from trying to drive culture change and also getting projects accepted into a larger narrative. But the functions go beyond that. Internally, for big organizations internally, it can inspire the culture, it can establish histories of innovation, increase buy-in, create solicit ideas. And then from an external standpoint, they can increase the brand perception as being innovative. Organizations more and more are looking to work with partners that are seen as trying to push the envelope. So creating that brand perception is really important from the beginning. And improving the personal branding of a thought leader. So an organization, a startup who has a CEO that's trying to get seen more and bring their ideas to life, storytelling can be a great way to give them better personal branding, generate pull and create alignment. So there's lots of really big functions that these stories can do. And so ultimately, one more slide. And what we found was that there's that these stories are really built upon 5 drivers. And so everyone that we talked with really talked about the need that every story must be able to show impact, must be able to create some amount of empathy to get people interested, must be able to align the groups and align your ecosystem, effective use of evidence, and then also be engaging. And so ultimately what we found is that innovators must be powerful storytellers. So let's take that and go into a little bit around the basics of story structure. So this really takes us back to first grade, primary school around story structures. And really there's a couple of different parts. You set the stage, you have a rising action into a climax, and then there's a following action that finally ties it together. And these different stages are around characters and settings. The problem or the challenge was where the climax is, and then finally this resolution. But there's a challenge that there's not great agreement on how to measure these different stages. So this is going to get into a little bit of the literature. and how organizations or how linguistics professionals and literary scholars are starting to look at stories. So this is a paper that was published, I think, 2 years ago by the James Pimbacher group out of Texas, talking about what is the core structures of storytelling when you look at text analysis. What's interesting about this approach and why this is going to be relevant as we go is that they actually do not look at the context of the story. They don't care about what the story is about. They look for the ancillary words, the things that really are not important. And they looked at them across 40,000 different traditional narratives and over 20,000 different non-traditional narratives like science reporting, TED Talks, Supreme Court opinions, so on and so forth. And what they proposed is that there's going to be 3 different parts of the story, which is really there's going to be a staging, there's going to be a plot progression, and there's going to be some amount of cognitive tension that gets created. And so when they go and analyze all these different narratives, the staging is really about the articles and the prepositions, which is really around defining information for the story. So who, the what, giving context around people and place. The plot progression is really looking at the auxiliary verbs and the pronouns, which is people that are doing things, they're action oriented, and they're very social in nature. And then finally, cognitive tension is around revealing when people are trying to make sense of these words or of their world. And what they found consistently is that for those traditional narratives, they all follow this basic trend, is that you have early staging, you have plot progression with the ancillary verbs, and then the cognitive tension rises and then falls through the story. But as you can imagine, nonfiction stories don't follow this trend. But what I'm going to show you is that on cognitive tension, that's not the entire case. And there's something that we can use from a storytelling standpoint. As I mentioned, there's going to be different tools that I'm going to highlight as we go through this. The tool from the Pimbacher group is called the Arc of Narrative. So you can actually take your stories and your different narratives and put those into the Arc of Narrative, and it will do an analysis on those 3 different factors: staging, plot progression, and cognitive tension. Okay, so let's talk about staging, or let's talk about cognitive tension and an innovation story. Really, there are 2 different stories that get told around innovation. Innovation is never like, here's this one overarching story. Everything's told in smaller stories that are driven towards some type of objective. And so the 2 stories around innovation from a high level view is that there's a plan or a problem to plan, and then there is this plan to solution. So you realize that there's a problem, and then the cognitive tension rises up to a point that you have a plan in which you're going to address that problem. And then once you have that plan, you go down the other side where you're actually experimenting, you're coming up with a resolution, solution, or dissolution of that problem. And then the cognitive tension goes away. And so from a, from a startup or from an organizational standpoint, these are proposals, projects, pitches. A lot of times are in this problem to plan. And then in the plan to solution, you have a lot of your project reports and other pieces of content that really report out on what actually happened and what really worked. And so there's different pieces of content that really solve this, addresses cognitive tension behavior. But from an innovator standpoint, innovators don't actually exist within one large narrative. They don't exist and say, like, here's the big story. And this is the challenge that innovators really face, is that they live in a continuum of stories that have different levels of tension, different levels of impact, that all result in their overall narrative, but that people really can't really focus in on. And even these small narratives, or we call these micro stories, these all still follow that same cognitive tension where they're identifying a problem and they're resolving the problem. And it's finding what is that right story that's in this continuum of micro stories that people actually will resonate with. And so when we shared Matt Doyle's example from Crest White Strips, that is a single story from what was Crest, how did Crest White Strips come to be? And he doesn't talk about the fact that they had to go and work with a lot of dentists to get buy-in from the American Dental Association. And there's a whole story around that. And so you have to be able to search throughout these micro stories to find what is the one story that people are going to resonate with, that's going to drive the purpose that you are looking for. Okay, so taking a step back real quick and kind of going through what are the takeaways. From there's a way to do analysis for stories. We showed you what that tool was, narrative, the arc of narrative. And you can go and put your stories in those and actually look at these different things like staging, plot progression, and cognitive tension. From an innovation standpoint, you're not going to have a lot of staging because you don't use a lot of those pronouns, and you don't use a lot of the ancillary verbs. So you don't have a lot of people like doing things together in innovation stories. So, but on the cognitive tension side, you actually get this, and this is, you look at problem to plan, plan to solution. So those are your different types of stories that you might see from an innovation standpoint. But it's also important to remember that when you're communicating out, that the innovator actually exists within a series of micro stories. And so you have to find what is that one micro story that you can pull out to align with your overall narrative to drive what that objective is. So it's important to do an audience analysis to determine what is that right story to share. Okay, so that's enough background. Let's talk about tools to actually create some of these stories. So when we talk about storytelling tools, and this is what we work with organizations, is that we break them down into frameworks, patterns, and techniques. The frameworks are really the blueprints, this is the standard story framework that you should follow. So this might be the Pixar story framework. We're going to talk today about AVT and CAR, could be the hero's journey. These are just, time-proven story frameworks that people use over and over again in order to construct that story. Most of the time, the frameworks are strategic narratives. They are there to convey a certain amount of information. The patterns, on the other hand, are really the decorations in the house. And so those are the personal experiences that happen within your innovation process or happen while you're working on your startup that really bring things to life for people who might be investors, people that you're trying to drive interest within. So that's what the patterns are. And so there are about 9 different patterns that we've identified so far from our research. And so we think that there's a lot of value in looking at how those stories get told and how you can build those stories out yourself. And then finally, you have techniques. And this is a lot of your audience analysis. This is getting into impact analysis. How do you determine how much data you need to share? That's all within the techniques. So those are more your tools. What we're going to start off with is just talking about frameworks and this cognitive tension curve. We have something called the Innovation Storytelling Toolkit. Within this is information around each of these different story frameworks, story patterns, storytelling techniques. And so you can get into this and actually dig around and see, learn about each of these different types of patterns, get some more resources, and see some really great examples of people using these in the field. So going back to the phases of an innovation story, problem to plan, plan to solution, these really circulate around 2 different storytelling frameworks. One for the problem to plan is your ABT framework. And what this is from a very simplistic standpoint, ABT is you have the ordinary world and there's something at stake or there is the value to be gained, but there's some type of problem or some type of cognitive tension. Therefore, here's the solution, or here's what the plan is in order to get to a solution. On the other side is your challenge, action, results. So here's the challenge that we were faced with. Here's what we did, and here's the results. And those results are supposed to relieve that cognitive tension from your audience. What we're going to focus on today is just the CAR framework, mainly because I find it to be the most fascinating, because it's often the most boring, but when people do it really well, it is quite impactful. Okay, so one of the people that joined us earlier, I think it was Kathleen, talked about water treatment, and we're going to hear from Jim Murkowski, who is the Senior VP of RD&E at Ecolab, and he's going to talk about a innovation that they did at Ecolab that was one quite impactful for their customers on detecting Legionella, but also very impactful for them internally at Ecolab. So we're going to listen into this.
One of the big challenges that exists in institutions, and hotels being a great example, or office buildings, cooling towers are a great breeding ground for bacteria and other problems. And one of the challenges that comes about, which is highly publicized, is Legionnaire's disease, which comes from the Legionella bacteria that can grow in cooling towers. Previously, it had been necessary to take water samples, send them to a qualified lab, wait 2 to 3 weeks in order to get your results to determine whether or not you had a Legionella risk.
Gotcha.
We've developed 2 new technologies, one called rapid biointelligence and one called water safety intelligence, which couple together to be able to give not only that result now instead of weeks, in minutes for a customer on their site,
Wow.
and as well give them an opportunity to be able to look across their networks and understand which facilities might be at most risk based on the chemistry that they're using to control Legionella and other bacterial growth, the environmental factors that they have, and so forth. So by making these technologies easy to use and accessible, we've been able to really drive a really interesting change, a step change really, in the ability to control Legionella.
That's unbelievable. I want to sort of...
One of the big challenges.
So that is their background work on 2 new products for Legionella detection. And so he shares this story, but you can see that it's very much in line with just a challenge, action, results framework. And when you look from a cognitive tension standpoint, as we mentioned earlier, is that if it's challenge, action, results, we'll see, high cognitive tension initially that eventually falls off over time. And so in this particular story, there is a little rise in cognitive tension, but by the end of the story, that cognitive tension has been resolved entirely. And so once again, this is a really simplistic view, or a very very traditional view at using challenge, action, results. What's interesting from my perspective is that Jim doesn't realize he's using a challenge, action, results framework, or that is a typical framework for storytelling or for creating narratives. And so part of this is really driving at making people more aware that these simple frameworks can be used very effectively. But then we go back and listen to Matt Doyle's story about crest white strips. It also is a car story. So it's still a challenge, action, results. And if you think about it, the challenge was, how do you keep whitening chemistry in the mouth in a way that is long enough that you can get the desired results? And the action that occurred was this serendipitous discovery that he talks about, and this interaction that occurred in the lab. So that was the action that he decided to highlight. And then finally, the results were that they created a new product and they disrupted the field. And so once again, it's a very high level story because he's talking about challenge, action, results from this whole thing. And also when you look at cognitive tension from his story, it once again is high at the very beginning, and that cognitive tension drops off as he goes because he's resolving the challenge that they've been faced with. But what's really interesting about Matt's example is that he laces into it a pattern. And the pattern is what changes this from a strategic narrative only to innovation story, or something that's tying in personal experiences. And so he has this discovering happy accidents pattern, and you have your initial plan, you have a surprising observation, and this changes the trajectory. And for them, it was that interaction between the two scientists in the cafeteria. And that's the very vivid part that you remember in the story. If you've never listened to Revisionist History by Malcolm Gladwell, there's a great episode about the King of Tears. And what he talks about in the King of Tears is that he looks at why country music makes people cry. And what he comes out with at the end, as opposed to like rock music or whatever, the reason that he arrives at the end is that it's the specificity that's used in those stories that people resonate with. So when you are talking with a group, you're talking with different audiences, that if you can find the stories that really resonate with them, those micro stories, and you can lace those into those strategic narratives, that you can really create something that's going to drive those groups or those individuals to action. And so in this case, he takes car, merges it with happy accidents, and you get something like this, which is, here's the challenge we're faced with. Here's this serendipity study or serendipity story that changes the path that we were going on. And here's what we were able to do now. Here's what's, here's what's possible now. Here's what we learned. And so you can lace these two together. And what you get when you do that, and when you do these frameworks and patterns, and you bring them together, they can all have different purposes. And so you could be looking at, how can I inspire my audience? And so you can take that ABT framework, which is really good for setting up a proposal or really good for setting up a pitch, and you can lace into it things about seizing the opportunity or aligning your ecosystem, or maybe even talking about failure. And on the other side, you might be looking at more informing, which is a lot of your CAR frameworks. And so you might be mining for insights. And you can use these tools interchangeably, not just for like pitches or for, story creation, but you can also use them for how you create strategic narratives around in order to motivate individuals or organizations. So an example might be that you're trying to bring a new technology into your organization and you need buy-in from a certain group. And so you want to go out and get feedback from that group in the place where they're working. Maybe it's a frontline worker. And so what you would want to do is actually use mining for insights with ABT. And so you basically have those groups through mining for insights establish what the ordinary world is, and here's what's to gain. And then you come back and say, here's what here's something that we're working on in order to address that issue. Would you like to be a part of it? And so that's using your frameworks and your different story patterns together to drive that innovation objective. What's cool about Matt's example is that even though cognitive tension does not, it's only half of that cognitive tension curve when you use CAR, everything else starts to show become a little more story-like. And so because you're using a little more of those personal pronouns and prepositions, you get a little more of that staging, and the plot progression, you're using a little more of the auxiliary verbs because you have people working things out, and the cognitive tension still stays the same. And so that is, that's the very basic, the basis around how you create an innovation story and how you use these patterns and these frameworks interchangeably. We have lots of examples. I know this was like very much a research talk, so I'm open to talking through any examples that people might want me to bring up, but we have lots of examples from our podcast. It could be talking about creativity and inspiration, like Duncan Wardle from Disney. Paul Smith is local, former P&G, and he has a bunch of great examples of stories that he shares. It could also be about the birth of Reebok, or the Reebok pump, which is Eric Cohen, Matt Doyle we mentioned about, and there's a lot of different articles that we've written based on this podcast. I'll also say that we are gearing up for our next innovation storytelling workshop if people are interested. This is a 4-week immersive experience where you actually go through and get feedback on the stories that you're working on. And you use these tools as you're creating your stories, and you get feedback from your peers, and you get feedback from us as well. So you could check that out. All these experiences come with access to our training, which is has about 9 different modules that are all online based content, and then also access to the innovation storytelling toolkit, which is something that we're continuously adding to in order to make sure that innovators and innovation teams have access to communication strategies, frameworks, tools, at any point in time that they need. So we can talk about that more if people have interest. And finally, any questions? We finished up in about 45 minutes, so I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have, or happy to talk through examples. Paul, you are on mute.
Any questions from the line? Yeah, I gave me the advisory there. John, you went off mute.
Yeah. So definitely passionate about this subject area, and I can see why. What are some of the ways that you can work with, startups that haven't been funded yet, who don't have a lot of capital to deploy?
Yep. So depending on what you're doing, we have something called it's a startup toolkit. Basically, it's for startups who are early stage that are trying to get their strategic narrative in place and try to work through a lot of these templates themselves within their small team. And we sell that as basically it's a packet that comes together. And so Meredith, I don't know if you have a link to that or not.
I am trying to get it pulled up. Our site's a little slow today.
Yeah. So anyway, but that has basically the workbooks that we use to work on like mission, vision, values. I'm pretty sure it does all of your like editorial content. It talks about how do you craft that strategic narrative. So that is a tool that is available that can be purchased.
The other question I have is around the alignment with like PR.
Mm-hmm.
How do you work with PR firms, or how is, it's PR firms are all about telling the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how to I don't know. I don't work with a PR firm, and never have I worked with a storytelling firm like yours. What tell me more about like your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so we work well with PR. A lot of times what we are doing is working. So we work with 2 different groups. One is that we work with the people who are trying to develop the next technology or whatever. So we, so we're helping them with that translation, or we're working up with the leadership on that strategic narrative. A lot of times we actually produce the content that the PR groups will use. So we have several ongoing examples that the PR groups that we work with are there for the placement, but we are actually the crafters of that narrative. And a lot of reason why that's true is that there's a lot that's going on in several of these different spaces, especially with startups. One group that we work with in particular is healthcare startups. And there's so much going on right now around digital transformation that organizations may not be able to pull all that together and decipher what is the narrative that's actually occurring and what is going to get this group placed strategically in order to talk about pushing that conversation forward, or maybe even redirecting that conversation. So for us, the PR is really about the placement, and we do work with PR agencies for that. We are mostly around what is that strategic narrative that's going to help position them to achieve their goal.
Thank you.
Where do you see the biggest challenges that startups might have versus maybe mid-sized companies and large companies. You showed that graphic that showed, hey, there's 14 hours, of startup storytelling, 7 for mid-size and 12 for large. And that's just telling you like the exact time frame. It doesn't tell you how efficient it is, how strong it is, right, at each stage. And so are there differences, or does it basically like, is it pretty much the same? I mean, you showed Matt and he looked like he was very just natural, right?
Yep.
And so anyway, like, I guess any insights on, where the differences are in terms of like struggles, and then how they can kind of like address them.
So once again, it's back to what is the strategic goal of those communications. So we actually did ask people at the different size companies, in which we had about 150 people fill out the survey. And then we had the 100 episodes from the podcast where we ask individuals. So that's the data set that we're pulling from. Within those different groups, there was really different motivation. So the question that we asked was, how important are the stories that you share to your success, your team's success, the organization's success? When it was the startup, and it didn't matter what, who the person was in the startup, they were mostly, the stories were shared for organizational success. It was not about the individual, because those individuals talked with the leadership all the time. They were constantly in conversation. In large organization, it was exactly the opposite. People did not feel that their stories actually impacted the organization, but they saw that those stories were really important for their success and their team's success. So it's for the large organizations, it's about you being seen. For the small organizations or for startups, it's really about how do we get our organization seen throughout all the noise. So those are the two different groupings. And Paul, since you brought it up, the medium-sized organizations, and we define that around 200 people or so, which is a lot of it's based on my experience at Shepherd, which was we had about 200 people there, and I always defined us as being medium. Is that they're kind of in this limbo, because across the board they didn't care. It wasn't about my personal success. It also wasn't about the organizational success. And I think that creates a big opportunity, because a lot of times those organizations, and a lot of them have been around for 100 years or so, they're just comfortable. And, figuring out, trying those different narratives, from a leadership standpoint, or from a ground level standpoint, could possibly push them into something, growing a little bit bigger, because they're seeing themselves in a different conversation. Yeah. So that's the difference that we saw. But really small to large, there was different motivators.
And the follow-on question, so early stage startups, so call it less than $500,000, right, in revenue, maybe. So companies that are just starting out, but call it like less than $500,000 for argument's sake. They're kind of in this stage of, oftentimes, of like, I wouldn't call it scaling. They're in market development, right? They're in like this stage of, who am I? Who do I help? Where's the common objective, right? And so, but you're also being told, hey, you got to get out there, get your message out there, right? And so it seems as if oftentimes there's this challenge to focus, right? But also the need to try different things, right? Because your message needs to connect with the right who, so to speak. How would you kind of like counsel startups in the way to manage the need for iterative storytelling? Like, how do you manage that, right? I mean, is it, hey, you create 3, 4, 5 different kind of story arcs, and you start testing them with prioritized who, targets, you know what I mean? And then like iterate from there and prioritize, or is that completely off base and there's a better way?
So we do teach an experimental approach to storytelling. And the reason why we teach it is that different audiences are going to resonate with different story arcs. So
Mhm.
we really help organizations early on try to find what are those right story arcs. But a lot of times for us, what we're telling people is what is the conversation that's going on in the field around the expensive problem that you're trying to solve, or the expensive immediate problem that needs to be solved. And doing some basic research around that and finding out what that narrative is, and then see how you can differentiate yourself or how you can contribute to that conversation.
Got it.
And I'll just add to that, that so there are a couple of tools in the toolkit that we use ourselves with our clients as well, in trying to identify those who's and
Mhm.
really honing in on
Yep.
specifics about them, what motivates them, what drives them, what
Yep.
needs do they have, what problems do you solve? And then from that, sort of a layered approach to uncovering more and more and more about those prioritized audiences that you have,
Yep.
to help you build those narratives that will work for them, but stays true to the overall story of your innovation, your company,
Yeah.
your brand, so that you don't just sort of have this splatter approach, that it is sort of strategic and mindful and intentional about the way you're structuring them and why you're leveraging them for those particular audiences that we've identified.
Yeah. I mean, so I mean, it's more complicated than this, right? But there's a level of like ethnography and like landscape assessment that you're doing a ton of to really understand whether it's in the digisphere, face to face, right? To really hone in on
Mhm.
who they are, what they're doing, like
Yeah.
where their
And
challenges are.
Well, and I can give you an example from our own experience. So we've been studying, we've had a research grant for doing this work on innovation storytelling, or a small one. And we've been researching this for about the past 3 years, and starting to do some peer-reviewed literature and thought pieces around this. We gave a presentation, I guess it was early last year, and our feeling about the market was that people need to be more aware of this, and that they need to be storytelling more. And we went out and gave a talk, and they were like, by the end of it, yes, of course, we all know that this is important. Tell us how to do it. And we didn't craft our story around that how. And so that's actually where our toolkit came from, was that we need to be providing something that is giving them the how. Because innovators, they like to read, people like to read books and get the little tidbit of knowledge that they need in order to, move them forward in some way. So they don't want to go through this, long spiel all the time. They just want to be able to go do it themselves and experiment. So that's why we created the toolkit, was in order to address that need and get more towards the how, and how do we construct these stories, as opposed to why this is important.
Yeah. Other questions? I love storytelling, so I could ask questions all day long. So I don't want to dominate the mic here.
Well, and if people, feel free to email us.
Nope.
Our email is very simple. It's Stephen or Meredith at untoldcontent.com. We love answering questions around this or talking through examples. And we are, this is what we're passionate about. And we want to see others become passionate and become effective at using these tools.
Awesome. Well, yeah, unless there's any other questions, what we can do is just adjourn for the day. Anybody else? I guess going once, going twice. We'll have the recording so you can look at it again, and maybe it'll spur other questions. Going 3 times, cool. So Stephen, Meredith, thank you very much for joining us today. Topic's awesome. Love the stories. Love the examples with Matt, and then I can't remember the gentleman's name from Ecolab, but cool to hear those, kind of bring them to life. For those of you that are still on the line, next month we're focused on things that are revolve around learning to start up or starting up your business. We've got Tarek Camille from Circle. He's the CEO of Circle. They are progressing. They're growing rapidly, but they were in a lot of your shoes, as recently as a couple of years ago. And then Christine Fisher with POSSIP. They're going to be on. And we're going to have a panel style interview with Anthony that will just focus on the challenges that they face starting up to help you gain some insights as to what they've done. Both of these companies, I believe, have definitely raised money. They are maybe even like at least seed, if not Series A money. But 2 years ago, 3 years ago, they were pretty fresh startups. So anyway, join us next month, third Wednesday of the month in March. And thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody. This was great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye.